You can own something legally, completely, for your entire life. And one morning, a piece of paper makes it a crime. No warning, no vote, no negotiation. Just hand it over, or 10 years in prison. This happened in the United States, not in wartime, not under a dictatorship in 1933, to ordinary Americans, with gold they had saved, inherited, and legally held for decades. And that is only half the story. The other half, the part almost nobody talks about, is what the government did 4 months later. It turns this from a crisis story into something else entirely. We will get there. And once you see it, the word emergency will never sound the same again. To understand what happened, you need to understand one thing about 1933 that most people today have completely forgotten. Back then, a dollar was not just a piece of paper. It was a promise, a legal promise that you could walk into any bank, hand over your dollars, and get real gold in return, a fixed amount. $20.67 for 1 ounce. That was the deal, written into law. Think of it this way. Imagine your country's money is like a gift card, and the gift card only works because there is something real behind it. Gold was the real thing. Dollars were just the card. People trusted those dollars because they knew gold was sitting in a vault somewhere, backing every note in circulation. And ordinary Americans were allowed to hold that gold themselves. Coins, bars, certificates, legal, normal, theirs. This is where the story should have stayed. It didn't. Then came 1929, the crash. The stock market collapsed. Banks started failing, hundreds of them. People lost their savings overnight. Fear spread fast. And when people are afraid, they reach for something solid. Gold. Millions of people went to the banks and asked for their gold back, all at the same time. And this is where the system got exposed. The banks did not actually have enough. They had lent it out. The gold on paper was much more than the gold in the vaults. So when everyone came asking at once, the banks started running dry. By 1933, over 4,000 American banks had collapsed. 1 in 4 Americans had no job. And from here, there was no clean way out. Franklin Roosevelt had been president for exactly 33 days when he signed the order that changed everything. The 5th of April, 1933, a Wednesday. Most Americans found out the next morning through the newspaper. The order was simple. All gold coins, gold bars, and gold certificates held by private citizens must be handed over to the Federal Reserve, the central bank, by May 1st. Less than a month away. The government would pay you $20.67 per ounce. But you had no choice about whether to accept. You were not selling. You were surrendering. Failure to comply? A fine of $10,000, roughly $200,000 in today's money, or 10 years in prison, or both. 10 years in prison for keeping your own gold. Think about who that hit. A farmer in Ohio who had saved 20 gold coins over 20 years. A widow in New York whose husband had left her a small bar. A shopkeeper in Chicago who kept gold in a safe because he did not trust the banks, which, as we just saw, was a completely reasonable thing not to trust. Same choice for all of them. Hand it in or risk prison. Most handed it in, but not all at once, and not calmly. First came the people who were afraid of prison. They showed up the next day, the day after. Lines formed outside Federal Reserve banks across the country. People carried coins in paper bags, in shoeboxes, in coat pockets. They placed gold on counters and received paper dollars in return. Then came the pressure on those who hesitated. Newspapers ran the penalties: $10,000 fine, 10 years in prison. Neighbors talked, employers talked, local officials talked. Allah, uncost, Allah. The message was simple: if you are holding gold, you are already a suspect. And then the rumors started. That the government had lists, that banks were reporting names, that agents were watching. None of it was confirmed, but it did not need to be confirmed. Fear does not require proof. It just needs to feel possible. That was enough. Some people buried their coins in the backyard. Some hid bars inside walls. A few sent gold abroad through relatives, but most had nowhere to hide anything and no one to call. The prosecutions were selective. The government did not have the resources to chase everyone, but they made examples, publicly, enough to make the risk feel real to everyone who had not yet complied. By May 1st, the deadline, the collection was massive. The government had pulled an enormous amount of gold out of private hands. Ordinary Americans walked in with what their families had saved across generations. They walked out with paper. And then, 4 months later, something happened that the history books tend to move past very quickly. But this is exactly the part you need to hear. January 1934. The Gold Reserve Act. Roosevelt signed a new law, and buried inside it was a single number. The official price of gold was changed from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce. Overnight, by law, the government told people, "Hand in your gold, we will pay you $20 an ounce." People handed it in. The government then said, "Actually, gold is worth $35 now." The profit went to the government, not to the people who had owned the gold. A farmer who handed in 100 ounces received just over $2,000. If he had kept it and sold it 8 months later, he would have received $3,500. He lost nearly $1,500 from that single change. Multiply that across millions of Americans, across billions of ounces. The government did not just take the gold, it repriced the gold after taking it and used that profit, the difference between $20 and $35, to fund its own programs, to give itself room to print more money without technically breaking the rules. Nobody voted on this. The president signed it. That was enough. And now here is the part most people skip entirely. The order did not apply to everyone equally. Jewelers could keep gold, industrial companies could keep gold, collectors could keep a small amount, up to $100 worth of coins, with special value. The list of exemptions was long, which means the law was not really about eliminating gold. It was about eliminating gold from the hands of ordinary people. The ones with lawyers and industry connections had options. The farmer, the widow, the shopkeeper had none. But the detail that changes everything is this. The Federal Reserve, the institution that received all this gold, was not a regular government agency. It was, and still is, a central bank structured to include private commercial banks as shareholders. When ordinary Americans walked in and handed over the gold, they were handing it to an institution that counted the biggest banks in the country among its owners. Think about what that structure means. The crisis was caused partly by reckless lending from commercial banks. The solution was a law that forced ordinary people to hand their gold to an institution owned by those same banks at a price set by the government, with no right of refusal. Nobody called it a transfer of wealth. It was called an emergency stabilization measure. The same banks that had helped cause the crisis were now holding the gold. Now, step back, because 933 America was not a one-time accident. It was a template. The same structure has appeared again and again. Different country, different asset, different decade, same outcome. Brazil, 1990. Fernando Collor de Mello had just become president. The country was in freefall. Inflation was running at nearly 3,000% a year. A loaf of bread that cost 1 cruzeiro in January cost 30 by December. The government needed to stop it fast. Their solution was something nobody had done at that scale. They froze every bank account in the country overnight. Not some accounts, all of them. The limit you could access, 50,000 cruzeiros, which sounds like a lot, until you understand that inflation had made it worth almost nothing. People woke up on a Monday and the money they had saved for years for retirement, for their children's education, for a house was locked inside the banking system, inaccessible, not stolen. The number was still there on paper, but they could not touch it. For 18 months, small business owners could not pay their suppliers. Families could not cover basic expenses. People who had spent decades saving for retirement found themselves borrowing money to live. When the accounts were finally unfrozen, inflation had done its work. People got their number back, not what the number was worth. Nobody was prosecuted for this. It was legal. It was a government policy. And if you think that was extreme, what happened in India 10 years ago was watched live on television by 1 billion people. India, 2016. Prime Minister Modi appeared on television at 8 p.m. on November 8th. What he announced in the next few minutes sent shockwaves across the entire country. All 500 and 1,000 rupee notes were no longer legal money, effective immediately. You had a few weeks to exchange them at a bank. These were the two most common banknotes in the country, the ones people kept in their wallets, saved in drawers, held in small shops. 500 million Indians had no bank account. For them, cash was not a convenience. It was the only form of savings they had. Many lived in rural areas, hours from the nearest bank. Many had never interacted with the banking system in their lives. Overnight, their savings had to be surrendered, taken to a bank, an institution many had never trusted, in exchange for new notes that were not yet printed in sufficient quantities. The lines outside banks stretched for hours. Some people collapsed waiting. Elderly people who had saved small amounts of cash for decades stood in the sun, not understanding what was happening. The government said it was a war on corruption, on cash held illegally by the wealthy to avoid taxes, and that problem was real. But here is what the data showed afterward. The vast majority of that cash found its way into new notes anyway, through schemes, through middlemen, through connections. The complicated money found complicated paths. The people who couldn't find a path, who had no accountant, no contacts, no options, those were the ones standing in those lines. Sound familiar? The structure is always the same. A real crisis, or one that is framed that way. An emergency measure that sounds reasonable. Rules that change faster than people can react. And the cost landing on the people who had no way to avoid it. Back to America, because the story does not end in 1934. For 41 years, it was illegal for American citizens to own gold. 41 years. A child born in 1933 would be 41 years old before they could legally buy a gold coin in their own country. Their entire childhood, their education, their whole working life in a country where owning gold was a criminal act. Meanwhile, the gold the government had collected sat in vaults, growing in value, going from $20 an ounce to 35, then to 60, then to 100, belonging now to the state, not to the people who had handed it in. The ban was finally lifted in 1974 under President Ford. The price by then, $180 per ounce. In 1933, the government had paid people $20 to take it. There is one final detail, small, but it stays with you. Among those who refused to comply was a man named Frederick Barber Campbell, a New York resident. He had over 5,000 ounces of gold stored at Chase National Bank. He refused to hand it over. The government prosecuted him. The court ruled, the government has the power to void gold clauses in private contracts. The government has the power to change the definition of money. The ownership of gold can be made illegal. The court upheld every part of the order. Campbell lost. His gold went to the government at $20 an ounce. The rules can change. You are not asked. In 1933, gold is illegal. Hand it over. In Brazil 1990, your account is frozen. In India 2016, your cash is no longer money. In Cyprus 2013, we are taking a percentage of your savings to save the bank. Each time, there was a justification. Each time, it was presented as temporary, as necessary, as being for the greater good. And each time, the cost landed on the people who had no way to avoid it. Here is the part that should stay with you. In 1933, insiders knew the gold order was coming before it was announced publicly. Some large holders had already moved their assets out in the days before. The farmer found out in the newspaper. The rules of money feel permanent. They are written into law, backed by institutions that have existed for 100 years. They feel like gravity, always there, always the same. But they are not gravity. They are agreements between governments and citizens. And governments can change the terms of that agreement, sometimes with warning, sometimes on a Wednesday, and you find out on Thursday morning. The rules around money are made by the people who control it, and they can be unmade just as fast, for reasons you will be the last to hear about. Right now, somewhere, there is a family putting their savings into a bank account because that is the responsible thing to do. The same families existed in America in 1932, in Brazil in 1989, in India in 2015. They were not naive. They were not careless. They were doing exactly what everyone around them said was correct. And then one evening, someone appeared on television. Or one morning, they opened a newspaper. If the rules changed tomorrow quietly, without warning, what would you actually have? Not on paper, not in the system, not in an account somewhere. What would you hold in your hands?